The cardiac cycle is the topic of the screencast. You may find information on the cardiac cycle in Chapter 11 of your textbook. This screencast was designed to help you achieve the following objectives. Describe the events of a cardiac cycle. Describe normal heart sounds. Define a heart murmur. Define preload, end diastolic volume, end systolic volume, and calculate ejection fraction. Your heart will beat about 100,000 times in a typical day and perhaps 3 billion times in your lifetime. When the heart does beat, a very specific sequence of electrical and mechanical events will occur, and we call these events the cardiac cycle. The cardiac cycle has 3 stages: atrial systole, ventricular systole, and complete diastole. Before continuing our discussion on the cardiac cycle, there is some terminology that you need to become familiar with. Systole means contraction. Diastole means relaxation. So atrial systole and atrial diastole refers to contraction and relaxation of the atria respectively. Ventricular systole and ventricular diastole refers to contraction and relaxation of the ventricles respectively. The words diastole and systole by themselves always refers to the ventricle. For example, diastolic pressure is blood pressure at the time when the ventricles are relaxing. This figure from your book illustrates the cardiac cycle. The first stage of the cardiac cycle is atrial systole. Here, the atria are contracting and the ventricles are in diastole, or relaxing. The greater pressure in the atria causes blood to flow from the atria into the ventricles through the open atrioventricular valves. Prior to atrial systole, the atria were relaxed and blood was flowing passively into the ventricles. Contraction of the atria delivers the last 20% of blood into the ventricles. During atrial systole, the semilunar valves, which open to the great vessels, the aorta, and the pulmonary trunk, are closed. This prevents the backflow of blood from those vessels into the ventricles while the ventricles are being filled. After contraction of the atria filling the ventricles, the atria begin to relax and the ventricles begin to contract during ventricular systole. Because pressure is greater in the ventricles than the atria, blood would tend to flow back into the atria, were it not for the atrioventricular valves, which close to prevent this. As the ventricles contract, blood pressure is now higher in the ventricles than the great vessels, and so blood flows through the semilunar valves from the ventricles into the great vessels. After the ventricles are emptied of most of their blood, they begin to relax. So now the blood in the filled vessels provides a greater pressure compared to the pressure in the ventricles, and blood would tend to backflow into the ventricles during complete diastole as the ventricles are now relaxing. The semilunar valves close to prevent the backflow of blood from the vessels into the atrioventricular valves. This stage is called complete diastole because not only are the ventricles in a relaxed state or relaxing, but the atria are relaxing as well. Blood pressure is greater in the atria than the ventricles. Therefore, the atrioventricular valves are open and blood is moving passively from the atria into the ventricles. When the atria contract to deliver the last 20% of blood into the ventricles, we will be at atrial systole and back at the beginning of the next cardiac cycle. The preload, or end diastolic volume, is the amount of blood in the ventricle just prior to ventricular systole. Stroke volume is the amount of blood that is ejected by the ventricle during ventricular systole. When the ventricle contracts, it does not empty completely. There's always some volume of blood remaining. The end systolic volume is the amount of blood remaining in the ventricle after ventricular systole. The ejection fraction is the percentage of blood delivered to the ventricle that is ejected by the ventricle. For example, if the stroke volume is 70 milliliters and the end systolic volume is 50 milliliters, then the ejection fraction is 58%. We take the stroke volume and we divide it by the stroke volume plus the end systolic volume. This tells us the efficiency at which the ventricle is operating. The sound that a normal, healthy heart makes is simply the closing of the atrioventricular valves and the semilunar valves. This is often described as a lub quickly followed by a dub and then a pause. Notice that in a normal, healthy heart, you cannot hear the flow of blood through the heart. Again, you are simply hearing the closing of the valves. The lub is the closing of the atrioventricular valves at the beginning of ventricular systole, and the dub is the closing of the semilunar valves at the beginning of diastole. I will now play normal heart sounds. Listen for the lub, the dub, and then the pause. When listening to an individual's heart with a stethoscope, if you hear anything other than the lub and the dub, the closing of the valves, then that individual has an abnormal heart sound or a heart murmur. Typically, a heart murmur is caused by turbulent flow of blood through the heart. Normally, blood flow through the heart is very organized and doesn't produce sounds that is audible. However, if there is disorganized, turbulent flow of blood through the heart, this can be detected using a stethoscope. Now, why would blood flow through the heart be turbulent? Well, typically it's because of a dysfunction in the valves. Perhaps a valve is stenosed, meaning it does not open completely, and there's turbulent flow of blood through the valve. Or the valve does not close tightly, it's incompetent, and it allows some blood to backflow through the valve. That also would cause turbulent flow, which could be detected using a stethoscope. Now in children, sometimes you can hear even laminar flow of blood through the heart because the walls of the heart are so thin. So a heart murmur in a child may not indicate dysfunctions in the valves. I would like to now play for you a heart murmur. This is what's called a mid-systolic murmur. It's a murmur that occurs during ventricular systole, ventricular contraction. You'll hear the characteristic shh sound as blood backflows through the mitral valve into the right atrium. There are many different types of murmurs. A murmur does not indicate that one needs medical treatment. I have a murmur and have had a murmur for several years. I know of other individuals who've had murmurs for many years as well. So if you have a murmur or you know someone who has a murmur, it just simply means that their heart is making abnormal sounds. It does not necessarily mean that they need some type of medical treatment to correct for a dysfunction. If you want more information on murmurs, go to this website. There is a link from Blackboard. Now let's review the objectives of this screencast. Describe the events of a cardiac cycle. Describe normal heart sounds. Define a heart murmur. Define preload, end diastolic volume, end systolic volume, and calculate ejection fraction. The topic of the next screencast will be cardiac output.